On a gray morning in June 1976, an old man lay dying in a 72-room Tudor mansion in the English countryside. Outside, gardeners tended roses that had bloomed for centuries. Inside, nurses moved quietly through corridors lined with paintings by Rembrandt and Renoir. The man was Jean-Paul Getty, and at 83 years old, he was considered the richest private citizen on earth. His fortune, built on black gold pumped from deserts halfway around the world, was estimated at more than $6 billion. But as his heart gave its final beats, the world's wealthiest man died essentially alone. His 5 sons were scattered across continents, estranged and broken. His grandchildren carried scars both visible and hidden. The women who had loved him lived in cottages on the estate grounds, none of them his wife, all of them waiting for scraps of affection from a man who seemed incapable of giving it. This is the story of the Getty family, a dynasty so plagued by tragedy, addiction, kidnapping, and early death that people began to whisper about a curse. A curse that seemed to prove an ancient truth, that all the money in the world cannot buy happiness, and sometimes it can destroy everything it touches. The story begins not in the oil fields of Oklahoma or the boardrooms of New York, but in a modest home in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where a boy named Jean-Paul Getty entered the world on December 15, 1892. The world he was born into was changing faster than any generation before had experienced. Electricity was spreading across cities. Automobiles were beginning to replace horses on the streets. And beneath the earth, a black liquid was being discovered that would power the 20th century and create fortunes beyond imagination. His father, George Franklin Getty, was a strict Methodist and a successful lawyer who had clawed his way up from poverty. George had grown up in hardship after his own father died when he was just a boy. He had known hunger and uncertainty, had worn clothes that were too small because there was no money for new ones. He worked odd jobs, scraped together money for school, and eventually earned a law degree from the University of Michigan. By the time his son was born, George had built a comfortable life practicing corporate and insurance law in what was then the flower capital of America. George Getty was a man shaped by his struggles, and he believed that struggle was necessary for character. He neither drank nor smoked, attended church faithfully, and expected those around him to live by the same strict moral code. He looked at the world and saw opportunity for those willing to work, danger for those who sought easy pleasures. These values he tried to pass on to his only surviving child, for there had been another child, a daughter, who died in a typhoid epidemic in 1890. That loss had hardened something in George, had made him even more determined to build something that would last. But George Getty was not content with comfort. He had heard stories of fortunes being made in a new industry, one built on the black liquid that bubbled up from the earth in places like Texas and Oklahoma. In 1903, when young Paul was just 10 years old, George traveled to Bartlesville, Oklahoma, and bought the mineral rights to 1,100 acres of land. It was a gamble, the kind that had ruined countless men who chased the dream of striking it rich. But George Getty's gamble paid off. Within 2 years, wells on his land were producing 100,000 barrels of crude oil every month. The Gettys were suddenly millionaires, and they packed up their lives and moved to Los Angeles, California, where the sun shone bright and the future seemed limitless. Young Paul Getty grew up surrounded by wealth, but also by his father's rigid expectations. George was a man who believed in hard work, discipline, and the moral teachings of his faith. He neither drank nor smoked, and he expected his son to follow the same path. But Paul was different. He was restless, curious, and drawn to pleasures his father would never approve of. After attending schools in California and a brief stint at Harvard Military School, Paul convinced his father to let him spend time in Europe. There, in the capitals of the Old World, something awakened in him. He developed a taste for art, for antiquities, for the finer things that money could buy. He also developed a taste for women, a pursuit that would define and complicate his entire life. When Paul returned to America in 1914, at the age of 21, he was ready to make his own fortune. His father, recognizing his son's sharp mind for business, if not his questionable morals, loaned him money to buy drilling leases in Oklahoma's Red Beds region. Most people believed this area contained little oil, but Paul and his father saw opportunity where others saw only red dirt. Paul bought the leases at rock-bottom prices, and when oil was indeed discovered beneath that red earth, he sold them at enormous profit. By June of 1916, at just 23 years old, Paul Getty had made his first $1 million. In today's money, that would be roughly $29 million. He had done it through a combination of his father's backing, his own shrewd instincts, and a willingness to take risks that more cautious men would never consider. But instead of diving deeper into the oil business, Paul did something that horrified his devout father. He retired. He moved back to Los Angeles and spent the next 2 years living as a playboy, chasing women, attending parties, and burning through money as fast as he had made it. George Getty watched his son's behavior with growing disgust. Here was a young man with every advantage, every opportunity, throwing it all away on fleeting pleasures. The tension between father and son would never fully heal, and it would cast a long shadow over everything that followed. Paul eventually returned to the oil business, driven perhaps by boredom, perhaps by a desire to prove himself to his father once more. Throughout the 1920s, he added another $3 million to his already substantial fortune. But his personal life remained chaotic. He married and divorced 3 times in that single decade, leaving a trail of broken relationships and wounded women. His father, still alive and still disapproving, made a decision that would haunt the family for generations. When George Getty died in 1930, he left most of his fortune, estimated between $10 and $15 million, not to his son, but to his wife Sarah. Paul received just $500,000 outright and 1/3 of the stock in his father's company. His mother controlled the rest. George Getty had made his final judgment. His son was not worthy of the family empire, but if George believed he could control Paul from beyond the grave, he was mistaken. Paul Getty proved to be a far more brilliant businessman than his father had given him credit for. With his mother's eventual support, he gained control of the family oil business and began expanding it with a ruthlessness that would have shocked even his hard-driving father. During the Great Depression, while other men lost everything, Paul Getty bought. He acquired Pacific Western Oil Corporation and began a long, patient campaign to take over other oil companies. He understood something that many of his contemporaries did not. Fortunes are made not in good times, but in bad ones, when assets are cheap and desperate men are willing to sell. In 1936, Paul convinced his mother to help establish a trust called the Sarah C. Getty Trust. This trust would hold the family's ever-growing wealth and channel it to future generations of Gettys. It was a smart move financially, protecting the fortune from taxes and ensuring it would survive for decades. But it would also become a source of bitter conflict among Paul's descendants, a ticking time bomb that would explode in lawsuits and family warfare. The most audacious gamble of Paul Getty's career came in 1948, when he negotiated for oil rights in the Saudi Arabian Neutral Zone. Other major oil companies had already secured the best concessions in the Middle East, but Getty saw opportunity in a stretch of desert that most considered worthless. He paid King Ibn Saud $9.5 million in cash, guaranteed another $1 million per year, and offered royalties that were 2.5 times higher than what other companies were paying. His competitors thought he had lost his mind. The land was barren, unexplored, and showed no signs of containing oil. But Paul Getty trusted his instincts. He poured another $30 million into exploration, drilling well after well into the unforgiving sand. For years, nothing came up but dust and disappointment. Then, in March of 1953, the drills struck black gold. Oil began gushing from the Saudi desert at a rate that would eventually reach 16 million barrels per year. In today's money, that single bet was worth more than $1 billion annually. Jean-Paul Getty had transformed himself from a wealthy man into one of the richest human beings who had ever lived. By 1957, Fortune magazine declared him the wealthiest living American, with assets that dwarfed the fortunes of the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, and every other dynasty in the nation. In 1966, the Guinness Book of Records went further, naming him the world's richest private citizen, worth an estimated $1.2 billion. But what did this unfathomable wealth buy Jean-Paul Getty? Not happiness, not peace, not love. By the time he became the richest man in the world, he was living alone in a massive Tudor mansion in Surrey, England, surrounded by art and servants and mistresses, but cut off from everyone who should have mattered most. He had been married 5 times and divorced 5 times. He had fathered 5 sons by 4 different wives, and his relationships with all of them ranged from cold to catastrophic. The mansion was called Sutton Place, a 72-room Tudor estate that had been built in 1525 for a courtier of King Henry VIII. The original builder was Sir Richard Weston, a man who had walked the corridors of power alongside the infamous monarch, a man whose own son would later be executed for supposed adultery with Anne Boleyn. From the very beginning, the house had been touched by tragedy, by secrets, by the kind of darkness that seemed to seep into its ancient stones. Getty bought it in 1959 for £60,000, about half of what the previous owner, the Duke of Sutherland, had paid for it decades earlier. It was a bargain, of course. Getty never paid full price for anything if he could help it. But it was also a fitting home for a man who loved art, history, and the trappings of European aristocracy. Here was a house with genuine pedigree, a house that had stood for more than 4 centuries, a house where kings and queens might once have dined. Getty spent years transforming Sutton Place into a showcase for his vast art collection. In the Great Hall, visitors could admire paintings by Rubens, including a magnificent work called Diana and Her Nymphs. In the library, portraits by Gainsborough and Bottoni lined the walls, their subjects staring down with the confident gaze of aristocrats from centuries past. In his own bedroom, Getty hung Raphael's Madonna of Loreto alongside a trio of paintings by Renoir, an unusual combination that somehow captured his eclectic taste, his appreciation for beauty across all periods and styles. The grounds were equally impressive. Gardens stretched across the Surrey countryside, maintained by teams of groundskeepers who trimmed hedges, tended rose bushes, and kept the lawns manicured to perfection. There were fountains and statues, paths that wound through ancient trees, views that seemed to stretch forever across the gentle English hills. The estate even included cottages where Getty's various mistresses were housed, each woman hoping she might be the one to finally capture his heart, each eventually discovering that his heart was not available for capture. Getty lived at Sutton Place for the final 17 years of his life, rarely leaving, rarely traveling, conducting his business empire from this remote corner of England, rather than the oil fields and boardrooms where his fortune was actually made. Part of this was practical. His business interests were centered in the Middle East, and England was closer to them than California had been. But part of it was something deeper, a desire to create a world entirely under his control, a kingdom where he set all the rules. And yet, despite all this beauty, despite all this history, despite all this wealth, visitors to Sutton Place discovered something strange, something that would become legendary in the stories told about John Paul Getty. In the ground floor of this magnificent mansion, accessible to anyone who wandered through, was a pay telephone. Yes, the world's richest man had installed a coin-operated phone for his guests to use. When reporters discovered this detail, they seized on it as proof that Getty was the greatest miser who ever lived. Here was a billionaire who couldn't bear to let visitors make calls on his dime. The story spread around the world, cementing Getty's reputation as a man so obsessed with money that he counted every penny even as his fortune grew by millions each day. Getty defended himself in his autobiography, explaining that the payphone was installed during renovations when workers and visitors were running up enormous long-distance bills. He claimed it was a temporary measure, removed after about 18 months. But the damage was done. The payphone became a symbol of something darker, a window into the soul of a man who seemed to value money above all else, including his own family. And nowhere was Getty's miserliness more devastating than in his treatment of his sons. He had 5 of them by 4 different wives, and his relationship with each was marked by distance, disappointment, and neglect. There was George, the eldest, trained to inherit an empire, but crushed by the weight of expectations. There was John Ronald, whose support for his mother earned his father's lifelong resentment. There was John Paul Jr., brilliant but troubled, who would lose himself to drugs and grief. There was Gordon, the musician and composer, who seemed to want nothing more than to escape the family business. And there was Timothy, the youngest, whose story might be the saddest of them all. Timothy Getty was born in 1946, the only child of Getty's 5th marriage to a woman named Louise Lynch, called Teddy. From the beginning, Timothy adored his father with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. He was a sweet, sensitive boy who wanted nothing more than to please the distant figure who loomed over his young life. But Getty was in Europe building his empire while Timothy was growing up in America. He missed his son's birth. He missed most of his childhood. He sent letters and occasional gifts, but he was never truly present in the way a father should be. Then, in 1952, when Timothy was just 6 years old, doctors discovered that he had developed a brain tumor. The diagnosis was devastating. The tumor would slowly rob the boy of his sight and eventually his life. For most fathers, this would be the moment to drop everything, to rush home, to spend every possible moment with a dying child. But John Paul Getty was not most fathers. He stayed in Europe. He continued his business dealings. He wrote letters expressing concern, but he did not come home. Even worse, when Teddy reported the mounting medical bills, Getty scolded her for spending too much money on treatment. He suggested that she limit Timothy's care to occasional checkups rather than aggressive intervention. Here was a man worth tens of millions of dollars, advising the mother of his dying son to cut costs on medical care. Timothy held on for 6 years, gradually losing his sight, gradually weakening, but always hoping that his father would come to see him. Getty regularly promised to visit. He set dates and made plans. But something always came up, a business deal that required his attention. a crisis that could not wait. The promises piled up, unfulfilled, while a little boy waited and wondered why his father did not love him enough to come. In 1958, Timothy Getty died. He was 12 years old, and his father, the richest man in America, did not attend the funeral. He said he was too busy. He said the trip was too difficult. He sent flowers and telegrams instead, as if his son were a business associate rather than his own flesh and blood. Teddy filed for divorce that same year. How could she not? She had watched her son die while her husband counted his money on the other side of the world. Whatever love she had once felt for John Paul Getty had been replaced by something cold and hard and unforgiving. His eldest child was George Franklin Getty II, born in 1924. George II was trained from childhood to take over the family business, groomed to be the heir to an empire that grew larger every year. But he lived in constant fear of his father's disapproval. He called his father Mr. Getty, a formality that spoke volumes about the distance between them. By the early 1970s, George was the executive vice president and chief operating officer of Getty Oil, the man everyone assumed would inherit control of the entire enterprise. But he was also deeply unhappy, haunted by feelings of inadequacy that no amount of success could erase. On the night of June 6, 1973, George Getty attended a party at his home in Bel Air. What happened next would be debated for years, the details shifting and contradicting depending on who was telling the story. What is certain is that George had been spiraling for months. The pressure of trying to please his impossible father, the constant humiliation of being overruled and ignored in business decisions, the weight of being heir to a fortune he had never asked for, all of it had pushed him to the breaking point. By the early 1970s, George had begun drinking heavily. He quickly moved on to pills, then to other substances, anything that might quiet the voices in his head that told him he was a failure. He once referred to himself as the vice president in charge of failure, a bitter joke that contained more truth than humor. He jabbed at his own arms with a letter opener, small acts of self-harm that hinted at the darkness gathering inside him. A week before that final party, he had written a letter to his mother, a letter full of morbid thoughts and ominous hints about the future. No one took it seriously enough. No one intervened. And so he found himself at that party in Bel Air, drinking heavily, taking pills, his mind unraveling before the horrified eyes of his guests. What happened in that bedroom has been recounted in different ways by different witnesses. Some say George locked himself in and began shouting, raging against his father, against his life, against everything that had brought him to this moment. Some say he fired a shotgun into the air, threatening everyone in the house. What most agree on is that at some point, he took a barbecue fork and began stabbing at his own stomach, unable or unwilling to stop himself. When friends finally broke down the door, they faced a terrible decision. George was the vice president of one of America's largest oil companies. They could not simply take him to a public hospital where reporters might learn what had happened. Instead, they drove him to a discreet private facility, a journey that took precious extra minutes. When doctors examined him, they discovered something the partygoers had not known. George had swallowed a massive quantity of sleeping pills. He died within hours. The official cause of death was reported as a cerebral hemorrhage, but everyone who knew the truth understood what had really happened. George Getty had taken his own life, destroyed by a lifetime of trying to please a father who seemed incapable of being pleased. And how did John Paul Getty respond to the death of his eldest son? According to those who were there, The first thing he asked for was a list of candidates who could serve as temporary vice president of the company. The business came first. It always came first. Just 1 month after George's death, tragedy struck the Getty family again, this time in a way that would shock the entire world. In the early morning hours of July 10th, 1973, a 16-year-old boy named John Paul Getty III was kidnapped off the streets of Rome. Paul III, as he was known, was the grandson of John Paul Getty, the son of his third son, John Paul Getty Jr. He had been living a bohemian life in Italy, a rebellious teenager who had been expelled from school and was surviving by selling his paintings and appearing as an extra in films. The Italian press had nicknamed him the Golden Hippie, fascinated by this red-haired descendant of American royalty who wandered the piazzas of Rome like any ordinary young man. The kidnappers were members of the 'Ndrangheta, a ruthless Italian criminal organization based in Calabria that had built a profitable business kidnapping wealthy Italians and holding them for ransom. They had been watching the Golden Hippie for weeks, noting his habits, learning his routines, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They grabbed the boy near the Piazza Farnese around 3 in the morning, knocked him unconscious with chloroform, and spirited him away to a remote location in the mountains of southern Italy. 2 days later, Paul's mother Gail received a ransom note demanding $17 million for her son's safe return. The conditions of Paul's captivity were nightmarish. He was blindfolded and transported through the rugged terrain of Calabria, passed from one group of criminals to another, always uncertain whether he would live to see another day. They chained him to stakes in caves, fed him scraps, gave him cheap wine and spirits to keep him sedated and compliant. For 5 months, this teenager who had wandered freely through the streets of Rome was trapped in darkness, not knowing if anyone was coming to save him. At first, some people doubted the kidnapping was even real. Paul had apparently joked about staging his own kidnapping to extract money from his wealthy grandfather. The Italian police were skeptical. Even some members of the Getty family wondered if this was all an elaborate scheme. But as the weeks passed and no ransom was paid, the reality of Paul's situation became terrifyingly clear. This was no game. The men holding him were prepared to do whatever it took to get their money. What happened next would define the Getty family legacy more than any business deal or oil strike. Gail Getty did not have $17 million. She was divorced from Paul's father, who was living in England, struggling with his own demons. But there was one person who had more than enough money to pay any ransom the kidnappers might demand. Jean Paul Getty, the richest man in the world, grandfather of the frightened boy chained to a stake in a cave somewhere in southern Italy, and Jean Paul Getty refused to pay. He issued a statement that has echoed through the decades since, a statement that seemed to confirm everything the world believed about his cold, calculating heart. "I have 14 other grandchildren," he said. "If I pay 1 penny of ransom, I'll have 14 kidnapped grandchildren." It was the logic of a businessman, perhaps. The logic of a man who had spent his entire life negotiating from a position of strength. But to most people, it sounded like something else entirely. The words of a monster who cared more about money than about the life of his own flesh and blood. The standoff dragged on for months. Paul III remained in captivity, chained in caves, moved from hiding place to hiding place, his captors growing more frustrated and more cruel with each passing week. They killed a bird he had adopted as a pet. They played terrifying games with him, holding guns to his head and pulling the trigger on empty chambers. And still, his grandfather would not pay. Then, in November of 1973, A package arrived at the offices of a Rome newspaper. Inside was a lock of blonde hair, a severed human ear, and a note written in the boy's own blood. "This is Paul's ear," the note read. "If we don't get some money within 10 days, then the other ear will arrive." In other words, he will arrive in little bits. The kidnappers had cut off Paul's ear with a razor, using brandy as the only anesthesia. They had mailed it to the newspaper, but an Italian postal strike delayed its arrival for 3 weeks. By the time the world saw that gruesome proof of their seriousness, Paul had already spent his 17th birthday in chains, wondering if he would live to see another. Finally, faced with evidence that could not be ignored, Jean-Paul Getty agreed to negotiate. But even then, his instinct was to bargain. The ransom was eventually settled at approximately $3 million, a fraction of the original demand. Of this amount, Getty agreed to pay only $2.2 million. Why that specific figure? Because his accountants had advised him that $2.2 million was the maximum amount he could deduct from his taxes as a kidnapping loss. The remaining $800,000 would be provided as a loan from grandfather to father, with interest charged at 4%. On December 15, 1973, 5 months after his kidnapping and on his grandfather's birthday, Paul III was found shivering at a gas station on a highway in southern Italy. He was alive, but he would never be the same. The physical wound would heal, mostly. Surgeons eventually reconstructed his ear through a series of painful operations, but the psychological wounds went much deeper. At his mother's suggestion, Paul called his grandfather to thank him for paying the ransom. Jean-Paul Getty refused to come to the phone. The years that followed were brutal for Paul III. He developed addictions to alcohol and drugs, demons that had plagued his father before him. In 1981, at just 24 years old, he overdosed on a cocktail of Valium, methadone, and alcohol. The overdose triggered a massive stroke that left him paralyzed, unable to speak, and nearly blind. He would spend the remaining 30 years of his life in this condition, trapped in a body that could no longer move, cared for by his mother until his death in 2011 at the age of 54. But the Getty Curse did not spare Paul's father either. John Paul Getty Jr. had been a promising businessman, sent to Italy to run the family's Italian oil operations. He was handsome, charismatic, and seemingly poised to become a major figure in the Getty Empire. There he met and married a beautiful Dutch actress named Talitha Pole, and the couple became darlings of the swinging 60s, friends with Mick Jagger and other rock stars, living a life of glamour and excess in a palace they owned in Marrakesh. They hosted legendary parties where the rich and famous gathered to dance, drink, and indulge in the recreational drugs that had become fashionable among the jet set. Photographers captured images of Talitha lounging on rooftops in flowing robes, looking like a goddess descended from some bohemian paradise. She was beautiful, free-spirited, and deeply in love with her troubled husband. Together they had a son, Tara Gabriel Galaxy Gramophone Getty, a name that seemed to capture all the wild optimism and tragic foolishness of that era. But that excess included heroin, and both John Paul Jr. and Talitha became addicted. What started as experimentation became dependency, and dependency became destruction. Jean Paul Getty Sr. ordered his son to stop using drugs, threatening to cut him off from the family business if he did not comply. But addiction does not respond to threats. John Paul Jr. chose the drugs over his father's approval, and the rift between them grew wider. Talitha tried to break free. She separated from her husband and seemed to be getting clean. But in July of 1971, she returned to Italy to press for a divorce, and there she fell back into the darkness. She was found dead in their Rome apartment, her body containing alcohol and barbiturates. Her life ended at just 30 years old. Some suspected she had relapsed and taken heroin again. Others wondered if it was something more deliberate, a final escape from pain that had become unbearable. John Paul Jr. never fully recovered from his wife's death. He retreated from the world, becoming a recluse, spending years battling his own addiction. Eventually, he found some measure of peace. He moved to England, developed a passion for cricket and rare books, and became a generous philanthropist. Queen Elizabeth granted him a knighthood in 1986 for his charitable work. But he too died relatively young, in 2003, at the age of 70, his body weakened by decades of substance abuse. And what of Jean-Paul Getty himself, the patriarch whose coldness seemed to poison everything it touched? He spent his final years at Sutton Place, surrounded by treasures, but essentially alone. His romantic life had been a series of short-lived affairs with women who hoped to become the next Mrs. Getty, but never quite succeeded. Several of them lived in cottages on the grounds of the estate, a harem of sorts, each wondering what she might inherit when the old man finally died. When he did pass away in June of 1976, they discovered the truth. Getty had spent his final years rewriting his will over and over, adjusting the pathetically small bequests he planned to leave them. One mistress was to receive $209 a month. Another would get $1,167. Only his longtime companion, an interior designer named Penelope Kitson, who had helped decorate his homes and his oil tankers, received anything substantial: 5,000 shares of Getty oil stock and a modest monthly income. But the real shock came when the full contents of Getty's will were revealed. The bulk of his fortune, some $750 million, went not to his surviving sons, not to his grandchildren, but to the J. Paul Getty Museum, an institution he had established in California to house his vast art collection. It was, at the time, the largest cultural donation in history, and it would eventually finance the construction of both the Getty Villa in Malibu, a recreation of an ancient Roman house, and the spectacular Getty Center overlooking Los Angeles. The museum became Getty's true legacy, a monument to the beauty and culture he had loved all his life. The story of how it came to be is itself remarkable. In 1954, Getty had opened a small gallery adjacent to his ranch house in the Pacific Palisades area of Los Angeles, a place where visitors could view his growing collection of art. But his collection quickly outgrew that modest space, and Getty began planning something far more ambitious. He was fascinated by the ancient world, by the civilizations of Greece and Rome that had produced art and architecture of timeless beauty. He had been collecting antiquities for decades, acquiring sculptures and vases and jewelry that had survived for thousands of years, and he wanted to display them in a setting that would do them justice, a setting that would transport visitors back to the ancient Mediterranean. The result was the Getty Villa, completed in 1974, just 2 years before his death. It was a recreation of the Villa of the Papyri, an ancient Roman country house that had been buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD and discovered by archaeologists in the 18th century. Getty spared no expense in recreating this Roman villa on the hills above Malibu. There were columns and courtyards, gardens planted with herbs and flowers that the Romans would have known, fountains and reflecting pools that caught the California sunlight, just as similar pools had caught the Italian sun 2,000 years ago. Critics mocked it at first. They called it a fake, a Disney version of ancient Rome, a rich man's folly. But visitors loved it, and scholars came to appreciate the care that had gone into its design. Today, the Getty Villa houses approximately 44,000 Greek, Roman, and Etruscan antiquities, including the famous bronze statue known as the Victorious Youth, one of the few life-size Greek bronzes to have survived to modern times. After Getty's death, the enormous bequest he had left to his museum allowed the J. Paul Getty Trust to expand far beyond what anyone had imagined. In 1997, the Getty Center opened on a hill in Brentwood, overlooking the sprawl of Los Angeles. Designed by architect Richard Meyer, it was a complex of gleaming white buildings that housed European paintings, sculptures, photographs, and manuscripts. The Getty had become one of the richest cultural institutions in the world, with an endowment that allowed it to acquire masterpieces, fund research, and preserve art that might otherwise be lost. But to his family, it must have felt like a final slap in the face, proof that paintings and sculptures had mattered more to him than the people who shared his blood. The story might have ended there, with the death of the patriarch and the distribution of his cold, conditional bequests. But the Getty Curse had only begun to claim its victims. In 1984, Getty's son Gordon, who had assumed control of the family trust, made a decision that would reshape the dynasty forever. He sold Getty Oil to Texaco for more than $10 billion, the largest corporate acquisition in history at that time. The sale generated enormous wealth, but also triggered years of litigation, as various family members fought over their share of the proceeds. The Sarah C. Getty Trust, which had been established nearly 50 years earlier to protect the family fortune, was finally opened and its contents distributed. Gordon and his brothers each received approximately $750 million. But the distribution was not equal, and resentments festered. John Ronald Getty, Paul's second son, had been disfavored by his father for decades, ever since he supported his mother in delaying a divorce settlement. When the trust was opened, Ronald received just $3,000 per year in income. His branch of the family was essentially cut off from the billions that went to their relatives, and the tragedies continued into the next generation. In 2015, Andrew Getty, the grandson of Jean Paul Getty and the son of the relatively successful Gordon, was found dead in his Los Angeles home. He was 47 years old. The circumstances were disturbing. He was lying in a pool of blood, apparently having suffered from intestinal bleeding caused by a stomach ulcer. But the coroner's report revealed something more troubling. Andrew had a toxic level of methamphetamine in his system when he died. He had struggled with addiction for years, though his family insisted he had been clean and sober. Just 5 years later, in November of 2020, another of Gordon's sons died under mysterious circumstances. John Gilbert Getty, 52 years old, and next in line to inherit a substantial portion of the family fortune, was found dead in a hotel room in San Antonio, Texas. He had reportedly missed his checkout time, and when staff entered to check on him, they found his body. The cause of death was later determined to be accidental overdose. John Gilbert's death came just 2 months after his mother, Ann Getty, had passed away from a heart attack at 79. She had been a prominent figure in San Francisco society, a philanthropist and patron of the arts, who had worked hard to use the Getty wealth for good. Her death and her son's death, within weeks of each other, seemed to underscore the relentless nature of the curse. The way tragedy seemed to follow this family, no matter how much money they accumulated or how much good they tried to do. Today, the Getty fortune remains one of the largest in America, estimated at around $5 billion spread among the various branches of the family. Some Gettys have managed to escape the curse, or at least to redirect its energy toward positive ends. Aileen Getty, daughter of John Paul Jr., has become a prominent AIDS activist and environmental advocate. Her brother Mark founded Getty Images, one of the largest stock photo agencies in the world. Their sister Ariadne has been a powerful supporter of LGBTQ rights, cheering on her child Nats, who transitioned and married a transgender woman named Gigi Gorgeous in a ceremony that brought joy to a family that had known so much sorrow. Gordon Getty, now in his 90s, has found some measure of peace through his music. He is a composer, an opera enthusiast, someone who has tried to use his wealth to support the arts, rather than simply to accumulate more. But even Gordon's story has its shadows. In 1999, it was revealed that he had maintained a secret second family for years, 3 daughters by a mistress named Cynthia Beck, who had been hidden from his wife and legitimate children. And then there is the legal cloud that continues to hang over the family. In 2023, a lawsuit alleged that several Gettys had engaged in massive tax evasion, fraudulently claiming to be residents of Nevada rather than California, in order to avoid paying hundreds of millions of dollars in state taxes. The case continues to wind through the courts, another reminder that the Getty fortune, however vast, seems to generate conflict and controversy in every generation. What are we to make of this family, this dynasty built on oil and tragedy in seemingly equal measure? There are those who reject the idea of a curse entirely, who point out that wealthy families often face struggles with addiction, conflict, and loss, simply because they are human beings, facing human problems with more resources and more scrutiny than most. They note that many Gettys have led productive, meaningful lives, contributing to charity, creating art, building businesses that employ thousands of people. The family name graces not just museums and gas stations, but also charitable foundations that have donated hundreds of millions of dollars to worthy causes. But there is something undeniably haunting about the Getty story, something that goes beyond the ordinary trials of rich families. The pattern repeats too often to be coincidence. The coldness of the patriarch, his seeming inability to love his own children, created wounds that passed from generation to generation like a genetic disease. His willingness to let his grandson suffer in captivity rather than part with a fraction of his fortune revealed something dark about the relationship between money and morality, something that chilled even those who had grown cynical about the behavior of the ultra-rich. And the parade of early deaths, overdoses, breakdowns, and broken relationships that followed suggests that whatever poison Jean-Paul Getty injected into his family, it continued to circulate long after he was gone. Some have tried to understand Getty, to explain if not excuse his behavior. They point to his own childhood, to a father who was strict and demanding, to a mother who kept emotional distance. They note that Getty grew up in an era when men were not expected to express feelings, when business success was measured in dollars rather than in the happiness of one's family. They suggest that his experiences during the Great Depression, when he saw fortunes vanish overnight, had instilled in him a fear of losing money that bordered on pathological. Perhaps, these defenders argue, Getty was not cruel so much as damaged, not evil so much as broken in ways he never understood. His willingness to let his grandson suffer in captivity rather than part with a fraction of his fortune revealed something dark about the relationship between money and morality. And the parade of early deaths, overdoses, breakdowns, and broken relationships that followed suggests that whatever poison Jean-Paul Getty injected into his family, it continued to circulate long after he was gone. Perhaps the real curse was not supernatural at all. Perhaps it was simply the burden of enormous wealth, the weight of expectations that could never be met. The loneliness of children raised by servants while their parents pursued fortunes and pleasures of their own. Gordon Getty himself seemed to understand this when he said that having too much money is dangerous, especially for children. More than you need is a curse, he admitted. If you have ideals, something bigger than yourself, you might escape it. Some Gettys have dodged it. Others have been clobbered. The mansions remain, monuments to the family's wealth and taste. Sutton Place still stands in the English countryside, though it has passed through several owners since Getty's death and was eventually seized by the British government from a Russian oligarch. The Getty Villa in Malibu welcomes visitors to its recreation of an ancient Roman house, where 44,000 antiquities tell stories of civilizations long gone. The Getty Center in Los Angeles rises above the city like a citadel of culture, its white travertine walls gleaming in the California sun, housing masterpieces that Jean-Paul Getty collected with an eye as sharp as his business instincts. And somewhere in those collections, in those carefully preserved objects, is the only kind of immortality that Jean-Paul Getty truly believed in. He knew that money alone would not be remembered. He knew that his business deals, however brilliant, would eventually fade from public memory. But art, he believed, would endure. Beauty would survive when everything else had crumbled to dust. Perhaps that is the final irony of the Getty story. A man who could not love his own children, who let his grandson suffer rather than pay a ransom, who drove his eldest son to despair, has left behind institutions that bring joy and wonder to millions of visitors each year. The museums are free to enter. The art belongs, in a sense, to everyone. The beauty that Getty hoarded in life has been shared in death, a gift from a man who seemed incapable of giving when he walked the earth. The Getty curse may never be fully broken. Wealth of that magnitude creates its own gravity, pulling in problems and temptations that ordinary people never face. But in each generation, there are Gettys who try to do better, who use their resources to help others, who refuse to let the darkness of the past define their future. They are living proof that curses can be challenged, if not entirely defeated. And in the end, perhaps that is the lesson of the Getty story. That money is neither good nor evil, but simply power. Power that can build museums or destroy families. Power that can create beauty or crush the human spirit. What matters is how we use it, whether we let it serve us or become its servants, whether we pass on love or only cold, conditional wealth to those who come after us. Jean-Paul Getty died with more money than almost anyone in history. But by the standards that truly matter, by the measure of happiness and connection and love, he died poor. His sons were strangers. His grandchildren were scarred. His legacy was a museum and a curse. May those who inherit great fortunes learn from his example. May they remember that the greatest treasure is not gold or oil or art, but the people who share our lives and depend on our love. May they break the cycle of coldness and build something warmer in its place. For in the end, all the money in the world cannot buy a single moment of genuine human connection. And without that connection, without love, without warmth, we are all of us, rich and poor alike, imprisoned in caves of our own making, waiting for someone to pay the ransom that will set us free.